Let's get joined up. This week's show is sponsored by Bandcamp.com, an online record store and music community where passionate fans discover, connect with, and directly support the artists they love. There's thousands of bands and artists on there, including my band, the Rye Dogs, whose second album, Pigs Might Fly, is out right now. Here's a quick snippet of the title track, which is also available on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Music.
Because your eyes may be weeping, but your conscience is sleeping. So baby, don't you cry. Your faces are drying and you say...
It's totally free to join Bandcamp, and as the Rye Dogs are brand new members, we're now looking to grow our fan base, so your support would be greatly appreciated. Just search the Rye Dogs, that's W-R-Y Dogs, and hit the follow button. Right, now we can cue the theme tune.
Joined up writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 169 with Paddy Crewe, author of a gripping new debut novel, My Name Is Yip. I chat to Paddy about how Wallace and Gromit proved to be the unlikely inspiration for his protagonist, his approach to research, and why he thinks you can't take any shortcuts with the creative process. Before that, a very quick catch-up from me. I've now completed yet another draft of my novel, and I've gotten it into good enough shape for submission, I hope, anyway. The first couple of submissions have begun, and I'm still getting great help and support with my query package from the members of my critique group. Like most authors, I would say this is my least favourite part of the process. For those of you who are yet to go through it, I'll kind of give you a quick overview. So specific submission guidelines can vary depending on the agent you approach, and you should always check the guidelines. But in general, you need some kind of cover letter. These days, that's an email that introduces you, your book, and shows that you've got at least some idea of where you can see your book in the market. You then need an excerpt of the novel, and this can vary, but it's often the first 3 chapters or 10,000 words of the book. And finally, the most painful aspect of them all, as far as I'm concerned, you need a synopsis of the whole book. This isn't a blurb or some kind of marketing pitch, it's just an overview of the entire plot of your novel from start to finish, including all the major plot points and spoilers. Most agents ask that this fits onto a single page. My first draft of it was about 5 pages long, but now, with lots of help, I think I've found something that gives a good sense of the main plot. But the truth is, out of all those requirements, the most important thing is still your manuscript. As long as your cover letter doesn't make you sound like some kind of buffoon or describes a book that's not suitable for the particular agent that you're querying, the agent will attempt to read your book. Published authors and even agents have admitted to me that this is what they really care about. Plot problems and other niggles can be worked out during editing, but if an agent just doesn't feel that attraction to your work and a desire to keep reading, they're going to reject you. It's as simple and as brutal as that. So once again, I'm starting to walk the road of rejection, and I'll keep you updated over the coming weeks and months as to my progress. In the meantime, I'm turning my attentions to coming up with another idea for a novel. I've got a few potential characters and premise ideas, and I'll be trying some of them out to see which, if any, looks like it's got the makings of my next book. And I've also got a premise for a follow-up to Safe Hands, but I'll only return to that if I can sell the first one, obviously. So that's me, but how are you all getting on? Get in touch to tell me what you're up to, and feel free to fire questions at me too. The best way to get in touch is via email, wayne@waynekellywrites.com, but you can also tweet me at JU Podcast or drop me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. It's totally free, and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up, and you'll be the first to hear about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview with Paddy Crewe. So Paddy was born in Stockton-on-Tees. After swapping a passion for sport for a love of writing, he studied at Goldsmiths, University of London. His first novel, My Name Is Yip, is published by Penguin on May the 5th and available everywhere you can buy books. So enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end for a sign-off.
Joined up writing.
Thanks a lot for coming on Joined Up Writing, Paddy. Really good to meet you. So why don't we start off just by giving us a sense of where you're speaking from, and tell us how things are going.
Well, thank you for having me. I am in my flat in North London, and things are going well. Yeah, I've just literally just finished writing this morning before I came here to talk to you.
That's good. Was it a good session?
It was actually, yeah. I got up a little bit early, about 6:30 to start, and yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it.
I like morning writing sessions. It's quiet.
I'm a little skeptical of the too early ones, where I remember reading when I was much younger. I think it might have been Will Self who used to say that the process was so similar to dreaming that it was he used to sort of wake up at the crack of dawn and sort of that was him away. But I tend to like to sort of be a little bit more
get your
grounded,
bearings,
get my bearings before I plunge in.
Get the first cup of tea or coffee down you at least.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, well, why don't you start off by telling us about your debut novel, My Name Is Yip. Tell us a little bit about that.
All right. Yip is, or My Name Is Yip, is fundamentally is an adventure story, really. I mean, I'd hope it's much more than that as well, but it's set in the early 19th century America, in Georgia, in a fictional town called Heron's Creek, and Yip is born, and pretty much immediately it's sort of something's not quite right, and he is mute and hairless, and it sort of becomes a social outcast, and eventually sort of, I think he's 15 when it happens, gold is discovered in the town, and things go from there, really. It's sort of from then on it's a bit of an odyssey with him and his pal Dud Carter.
Yeah, well, it's such a great premise and an unusual choice of protagonist. Do you remember kind of what the jumping off point was for the book, or was there something in particular that got you started off on it?
I mean, it's always incredibly difficult to sort of follow an idea back to its origin. But I remember watching Wallace and Gromit and sort of thinking about why we are so invested in Gromit and why he's such a powerful character despite him not saying anything. Yeah. And I then sort of introduced, I was at university at the time, and so Yip originally in my first drafts he was a sort of sidekick to a female narrator whose name I can never remember. But so originally he wasn't the protagonist at all. And then as I remember, as I was sort of writing more and more about him, I just became sort of fascinated by what he would be thinking, what he would be wanting to say. So it just seemed like a great sort of little thing to explore. And then from that point on, the rest is history, I suppose.
Absolutely. And what sorts of, just can you give us a kind of a sense of, I mean, I'm sure people can kind of think about the challenges that anybody would face that's kind of got the sort of things that he had to face. But at the time, in that particular period, in that particular place, what sorts of challenges would a character like this have to face? Well,
I mean, someone like Yip would immediately be assumed, as a lot of people do in the book, he would be assumed to be stupid and have nothing at all to say for himself. That would have been the general assumption. There would have been, certainly people wouldn't have given the time of day, really. So he very much would have been, or I imagined him to be a sort of complete outcast, to the point where even his own mother isn't able to sort of deal with him,
sort of connect to him.
Yeah, and because she, which through no real fault of her own, she can't. It's just she's sort of ill-equipped to deal with it. It's all sort of slightly tragic to begin with.
Sure. And how did you go about researching the time and the period and everything? Was it kind of a period and a place that you'd kind of already got some knowledge about, or how did you go about that?
A little bit. I mean, but yeah, I did sort of went down the usual routes of lots of reading and all that sort of thing. But I'm not. I don't think I'm necessarily unusual in this, but I don't like to do too much research to begin with. I was recently listening to Robert Eggers, the film director who has the new film The Northman that's coming out, and he was talking about researching, and he's sort of the opposite to me in the sense that he sort of completely sort of immerses himself in it and sort of exhausts it, whereas to me that's sort of the last thing I want to do. If I was sort of reading every last page and of every book I could get my hands on, then I don't feel like I'd have the energy or the desire to make a story out of it. I feel like I might sort of run out of steam a little bit. So
I think it's almost like you need to leave something to your imagination, give yourself some work to do.
Yeah, exactly. Because I don't think I'd enjoy it otherwise. It all becomes sort of slightly academic. Whereas I'm ultimately I'm trying to entertain myself, and sort of by virtue of doing that, hopefully entertain other people. But yeah, that's a big thing for me. I want to sort of feel free to go where I want. And sometimes if you feel like if you've sort of done a massive amount of reading, then you end up sort of closing some of those routes off to yourself, and your imagination doesn't quite have the freedom it needs to go on. Yeah.
It's very much got your voice. So why don't we take a step back a little bit? So let's go back in time a little bit. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up and how you came to writing? Because I think you were previously headed in a totally different direction. Is that right? To writing, should I say?
Yes, that is, yeah. I grew up in the North East. I was born in Middlesbrough, and the direction I think you're referring to was that I played a lot of sport when I was growing up, and had no real interest, truth be told, in reading. I wasn't in the slightest bit I wasn't particularly good at school. I sort of my world revolved around playing football and cricket and rugby and all those to a fairly high standard, and that seemed until I was about 17 maybe, that seemed to be where I thought my life was heading. And then sort of books got in the way, really. My brother had always, who's also a writer and whose novel comes out next year, he was far more into, that's all he ever used to do was read, and I was completely baffled by him.
So what do you remember? Was there there probably wasn't, because it only tends to happen like this in films and things, but what was there like a breakthrough moment, or was there what was the kind of thing, or the defining moment? Was it a book? Was it a moment? Do you kind of remember?
I knew that I wasn't enjoying playing sport anymore, but I was, because after you've invested so much time in something, and it's actually quite unnerving to think of doing anything else. But there were a few little things that happened. I'd read of Mice and Men at school, and we were also studying Simon Armitage's poetry, among other things, both of which I seemed to connect with. And I think the big thing was that I read. I mean, I was always encouraged to read. My parents were and still are readers, and I was encouraged to read A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. My dad gave it to me and said, "This is great, you've got to read this." And I do remember reading it and finishing it, and I was sat outside on the bench, and we had a little sort of courtyard area in the house we used to live in, And I remember finishing it and thinking, this is something that I have to do. I'd love. I don't know how he's done this, but it's something that I would like to do. So I'm going to say that's the moment.
And how did you kind of? So it's one thing, sort of, as you say, having that germ of an idea and thinking, yeah, this is something that I'd like to do. How did you go from there to, writing your first book?
I gave myself 10 years. I think I probably finished that about, I think I was about 2020 or 21 when I read Prayer for and Me. And then I just became sort of completely obsessed by the idea in a way that I think you sort of have to if you want to do anything like that. And sort of basically applied the same principles as I would, perhaps slightly unusually, that you would to playing sport, to sort of playing to reading, and sort of read everything that I could get my hands on and read more than anybody else. I decided, because I'd dropped out of university when I first went when I was 18, or more than anything, I'd discussed it with my parents, and the sort of time that university affords you to sort of really sit down and work on your stuff. It was decided that was going to be the best option. I really wanted to give it a good crack. So I then moved to London and went to Goldsmiths, and and basically sort of started to really sort of take it as seriously as I could, which is not a particularly easy thing to do, because there are plenty of people who aren't taking you seriously when you're saying you're going to do something like that. So it's a matter of sort of discipline and sort of digging your heels in, really.
And did you have an idea about what kind of books that you wanted to write? I know obviously My Name Is Yip is your debut, but is that your first attempt at writing a novel, or was it just the first that's made it to publication?
Yeah, Yip was the first thing that I really thought, this seems like something I can do. But sort of before that, I'd always been disciplined. I always worked hard, and would get up on a morning before going to work and do something, and then do it when I came back, and all that sort of stuff. Which, even if you're writing rubbish, it doesn't really matter. It's just the fact of sitting down and doing it. Yeah.
Sort of, as you say, going back to that kind of sports analogy, it's the training, you put in the hours in, and you're doing your drills or whatever, if you like, you're building
exactly up. Yeah, I mean, it's there are endless comparisons to be made between the two. It's to me, even when I on a morning before I write, I'll often go on a walk, and then I might read something that's in the sort of atmospherically similar to what I'm doing, and it's the equivalent of warming up to me before you would you wouldn't necessarily go and play a game of football without stretching or doing a few whatever laps of the pitch. It's getting yourself in the right frame of mind, in the right place.
And give us a sense, so just tell us a little bit about your actual path to publication. So when you got, so obviously the first big thing was getting an agent, and somebody to kind of, how did that feel? Do you remember when you got the call or the email or whatever it was, that when you found out that someone was actually going to take you on or take the book on?
Yes. It's funny because I actually haven't thought about this since, because you don't really get asked these questions. I remember it because I was utterly sort of despairing of the fact that nothing was happening, and I thought, well, I'm just going to sort of start something else, and I'll put this to one side. And I was on a bus back to Darlington. I didn't have any money to get the train, so I was on the bus, which is it's like 6 or 7 hours, but it can be horrendous, because there's often screaming children on there, and somebody's vomiting somewhere and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So I was having a horrible time, and but then I got an email from somebody at the agency. My brother's agent emailed me and said he'd shown it to Zoe, who is now my agent, and she was sort of completely bowled over by the voice and really loved everything about it. And could I come and meet her next week? So yeah, it's a huge turning point, really. And I remember thinking, this could be sort of where it all kicks off. I mean, it's all slightly unnerving as well whenever anything like that happens. But
in what way,
yes.
when you say that, what do you mean by that? In what way were you unnerved? Why were you nervous about it?
Because I think anything that's lived for that long just in your head, and you've just been sat in your bedroom doing it, for it then to, even for to understand that strange, people that you don't know have read it and have come across it is a peculiar thing to happen. It's not exactly mind blowing, but it is odd, and it takes some sort of getting used to the fact that it's actually no longer just this. It's no longer just your sort of property.
So yeah, I mean, and obviously, so you managed to get an agent, and was there still a little bit of work to do on the book, as there often is in these situations? How did you go on with that?
Yeah, I'm trying to. I don't think I'd actually finished it by the time I'd got the agent, or if I'd finished it, then I'd done what I'm sort of doing now with this next book, which is sort of leaving the ending as sort of blurry as I can, for fear you sort of make any rash decisions. Maybe I'd done something like that.
Then you kind of had to start working on it, presumably. Did you work on it with your agent?
Well, I hadn't realised that sort of agents these days have a far more sort of hands-on role with the book itself, rather than just the sort of the sort of backstage handling of it. And Zoe, very quickly revealed herself to be a sort of remarkably intelligent reader, and had some great suggestions. Zoe was great and continues to be, and it's a lovely thing, and I feel very, very privileged actually to have, because I know it's not the case with everybody, to have an agent who they feel sort of free to talk to and really sort of respect their opinion. So I feel very fortunate in that sense.
And presumably, I know you're not going to want to talk loads about your next book yet, because your first book's only just coming out. But so don't go into detail too much. But in terms of the actual process, what do you think you've learned from writing My Name Is Yip, as regards, when you started the second book, or when you continued with the second book? Did you approach it differently? Did you have a different mindset? How did that work?
I mean, it's sort of radically different in the way it's written. So I sort of had to approach it differently in that sense. But it's sort of broadly speaking, no, it's the same. It feels, it feels the same as it did the first time. It's an exciting thing to do. But I'm not particularly precious about ideas or where they come from, or sort of, I don't understand writer's block or any of that nonsense. I just think, that things are there to be written, and the ideas you sort of audition them, and then you can write for a while, and then sometimes you get rid of them, sometimes you don't, but it's all going in the right direction. So it was the same thing, really. I just sort of started, and
so on that subject then, as regards your process, just give us a sense of it. Do you tend to you get a little bit of an idea and you just go headlong into a scene or with an idea or whatever, or do you start doing that? Do you plan? Talk us through that, how it works. If you were sitting down to write a new book tomorrow, how would you sort of go about it?
I would write. Yeah, I would immediately sort of plunge into it. Maybe this is evident in my writing, but I have no sort of there's no very, very little planning going on. I mean, you can sort of like on my wall at the moment above my desk is like sort of arrows pointing in various directions to things as sort of little milestones. But I mean, there's no thorough plan that I'm working from. I was thinking about it yesterday, maybe about sort of ideas, because it's often when you've written, this is what people ask about. They say, where do you get your ideas from? And the truthful answer is that you have absolutely no idea where you get them from. But I was thinking about it, and I think it's not quite as sort of mystical as people can make it out to be. I think there is an element of being actually sort of training yourself. It's just a way of thinking. If you've read an enormous amount and you've been interested in seeing how books work and sort of really paying attention to how they're put together, then it's sort of, and then you sort of apply that to your own life. And when you're sort of looking around, it's a matter of sort of things start to attach themselves to other things in ways that I don't think they would necessarily do, if you weren't invested in reading and writing.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the headspace that you're in. And again, going back to the sport analogy, I think if you're doing sport full time or whatever that happens to be, whether it's sport or whether it's, I don't know, whatever, carpentry or whatever it is, I think if that's kind of what's dominating your headspace at any one given moment, then the truth is even when you're not doing it, you're in some way thinking about it, even if it's on a subconscious level. So you tend to make connections and you tend to find ways to bring it back to that, even if it's, to use the carpentry thing, it's like, well, that piece of wood over there would probably make a nice table or whatever. I think it's probably a similar sort of idea. I know, I write songs, and sometimes when I'm in that zone, if I'm happen to be in a period where I'm writing a few songs or whatever, then I tend to find where whatever I'm doing or wherever I'm going, I tend to think about a melody, or I'll hear something, or I'll be listening out for a little phrase or something that I think I might be able to use. And I think it's probably the same thing when you're writing books.
I think it is the same. Yeah, I've just listened to one of your songs actually.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
I very much enjoyed it. I think it's called Needle on the
Black. All right, thanks. Oh, that's people think I'm paying guests because that's 2 in a row where people have mentioned that song. So how do you're talking about getting in the zone? Do you think now that you're kind of doing this and you're doing it for a living, obviously your debut's coming out, you're working on your next book, do you still have to, you mentioned about getting warmed up and all the rest of it, but kind of how do you get into the zone now when you're sitting down to write?
Well, this is where I start to contradict myself horribly. And
that's fine. That's what everybody does.
Yeah. Because there's sort of so much that's sort of, as I was saying earlier, that sort of discipline side of it, where it's just sort of really about sitting down and getting on with it. And in many ways, I think, well, that's the sort of real key to it. But then there is the other side where there's, there are some sort of theatrics involved. Where I would write, for a lot of what I've been writing now, I would only write with by candlelight, for example. So the blinds and would be drawn, and because it doesn't make any sense for me to be looking out the window and seeing cars driving past when I'm trying to write about
you're going back in time,
Victorian London. So there are it's not to sound sort of too Daniel Day-Lewis about it, but there are ways of work, getting you sort of little tricks.
Have you got like a special writer's jacket or anything like that?
I think I used to have something like that. I would occasionally wear a sort of an odd, one of those caps with a propeller on it.
Oh yeah.
I think I used to occasionally would have that on.
Whatever works is my
whatever,
view
exactly. On it. Whatever works. But sort of little, then I'd go, I live near a sort of an amazing cemetery, Abney Park Cemetery, which is just, to me, is just one of those really special places. And you know, I would walk around there every morning before I started writing, particularly at the beginning, because it just puts you in a different, you know, it's like going back in time, and that's you know, basically what you're after. So yeah, loads of little sort of stupid tricks, sort of, you know, superstitions that you do to try and help you along. As you say, anything helps.
What do you think drives you to write? I mean, obviously you kind of relatively speaking, you sort of came to writing late, but not really that late. But obviously you seem to be going a different direction, and when you had a passion for sport and all the rest of it. So what drives you to write now? What gets you sitting in that chair most days?
Well, first and foremost, I enjoy it. I would do it whether anybody read it or not, which I think is a massive advantage. And you know, I think it's to do with that sort of the living of your everyday life just never felt it all felt a bit thin, really. And it didn't, I sort of needed more from it. And, you know, and, you know, wanted to sort of explore other, what it was like to be sort of other people. I think that's basically it. Maybe, you know, in sort of reality, you know, we're horribly aware that everything is beyond our control, but to sit down and write is to take control of something, and is to sort of order and orchestrate a life in the way that you want it to be. And there's something very attractive about that.
Definitely. So what do you think is kind of the most common mistake that new writers make in your experience, or that you think when people first start making it, when they first start writing?
A mistake that it's, you know, the classic one, that it's like, you know, writing a book is sort of a terribly sort of glamorous thing, where, you know, they're sort of in a constant state of inspiration, and you know, they're going to sit there and everything's going to pour out, and it's going to look like it,
like,
you know,
all those montages you get in films.
Yeah, and it's all going to sort of come together without a great deal of sort of hard graft. And yeah, I think that's the biggest mistake, that for some reason with any sort of artistic endeavor, we tend to sort of accommodate the idea that, oh, we should, you know, you can sort of go about it in your own time and it'll be fine, and you know, that you're sort of relying on something other than hard work to get the job done. Yeah.
Do you ever suffer from self-doubt, Paddy? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be bizarre if you didn't suffer from self-doubt. How do I deal with it? I suppose you just acknowledge it for what it is, that it's a natural part of the process. I mean, without it, I think you would go completely off course. You know, it's there for a reason. You know, within, you know, obviously you don't want it to become overwhelming to stop you working, but you know, you've got to use it.
Okay, as we sort of move towards wrapping things up, what would you say has been, and again, you might not be able to just pull this out of you, just think off the top of your head, but what's the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice you've been given? And that might not necessarily have to apply directly to writing. It could have been something that you picked up in whether it was in sport or anything else, any other aspect of your life.
I don't know whether anybody said this to me, but I think it's something that I've come to learn about myself in the process, is that that I sort of can figure out that something's worth writing about, and me spending, you know, potentially years on it, if it feels like only I could do it, if that makes sense. Is that I sort of, you can sort of have an ownership over an idea in a way that, you know, you can't over some others. It feels like, I know that sounds sort of slightly numinous.
Sort of like you mean only you could write it. You could write that particular thing. Yeah.
And and it becomes this sort of, you become sort of joined at the hip with this particular idea, because, you know, nobody else is going to do it. It's a great feeling.
Yeah, it's a bit like years and years ago, I went to a BBC writers' room thing on TV writing, and somebody in the audience put their hand up, and they were kind of obsessed with, as you often get at these things, you always get somebody that's obsessed with like the technicalities, or like how do I format the script or whatever. And this particular person put his hand up and was obsessed with copyright. And he kept saying, how do I know if I send my script into you, the BBC, you're not going to rip it off, basically? What do I do about copyright? And the guy gave an answer that's very similar to what you've just said, in the fact that he said, well, whatever you send, in theory, whatever the idea, because there's no such thing as an original story in terms of, you know, the shape of it and the hero's journey and all the rest of it. There's only so many different stories we can tell. But that whatever you send me, it should be something that only you could write.
Yeah, exactly.
And once you know that, if somebody else picks it up, they're still not going to be able to write it in the same way that you wrote it, with your voice and your background and everything that you're bringing to it. And if you're not bringing that to it, and if you're not putting that kind of unique voice into it, then it's kind of probably not going to be worth anything anyway. It's the kind of way to look at it.
That's it. You know, it's half the battle is, if not more than half the battle, is having faith in what you're doing.
If you were starting again tomorrow as a new writer, do you think there's anything that you do differently, or there's anything that you go back and tell your younger self?
I don't think so. I think it's just such a massive learning process, and I think you need to go whatever that path that takes you to the point where you achieve some success. It is probably a very necessary path to take. I mean, you don't really want to be taking any shortcuts. You want, as tempting as that would be, I think, all of these things, you need to go through it, and you need to learn the hard way sometimes. So I don't think I would have anything to say differently, really.
Because that's the journey that's made you who you are today.
Yeah, exactly. Without sounding too sickly sweet about it.
No, it's a good answer. Okay, so as we kind of wrap things up now, why don't you tell people first of all, remind them when My Name Is Yip is out, because I believe it's May the 5th, is that right?
It is May the 5th, yeah.
Hardback, so when this comes out, it'll be pretty much out, this conversation, so that's great. And where can they find out more about you online and maybe reach out on social media or whatever?
Well, that's where it would be very difficult for them. I have no presence on social media, so you can't find me anywhere. Maybe you can.
And that's how he likes it, ladies and gentlemen.
Exactly. You can bump into me and you can come and find me in the graveyard.
Yeah, just give us your personal address and that's fine.
I'll be pottering around on a morning.
All right, Paddy. Well, it's been brilliant to speak to you. Good luck with the book. And for now, thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Joined Up Writing.
Okay, thanks again to Paddy, and I'll put a link to his book in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk, or you can find it in the podcast description on whatever device you're listening to this on. That pretty much wraps it up for this week, but don't forget to get in touch with all your thoughts on the show, your feedback, and to tell me what's going on in your writing world, and you can do that by dropping me an email at wayne@waynekellywrites.com. Also, remember, you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews, and that's a lot, by the way, on the website. And make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts to have the podcast downloaded automatically every week. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts, because it really does help others to find the show, or, just tell one of your mates. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.